Marcus Hale spent the last $2,000 of his life on a building that looked like it had already given up. The roof was a patchwork of rust and holes, the kind of damage that accumulates not from one storm but from years of neglect, each winter adding another layer of warped metal and sagging timber to a structure that had stopped being worth the cost of repair long before anyone admitted it. The floor was cracked concrete, stained black with old oil that had seeped into the stone over decades, an archaeological record of every engine that had ever bled out on that floor. 3 windows were boarded over with plywood, so warped it curved away from the frame like a dying hand reaching for something. The neighbors called it the pit. They called it the eyesore. They called it a waste of good land in a part of Detroit that had very little good land left. And they said these things not with malice, but with the resigned certainty of people who have watched too many ambitious projects collapse into worse situations than the ones they replaced. But Marcus stood in front of it on a gray Tuesday morning in late November, hands deep in the pockets of a jacket that wasn't warm enough for the weather, and he looked at it the way a drowning man looks at a piece of driftwood, not because it was beautiful or safe or promising, but because it was there and he was out of alternatives. He signed the paperwork in the office of a man who couldn't hide his relief fast enough, shook a hand that barely shook back, and walked away with a key that barely worked for a door that barely hung on its hinges. That was the beginning. Nobody watching would have called it that. He had been something once, something real, something that other people in the industry recognized and respected before the industry decided it no longer needed him. For 11 years, Marcus had worked as a mechanical engineer at Dalton Automotive, one of the largest vehicle manufacturers in the region, a company with a long history and a reputation for production volume that it sometimes mistook for quality. He was not the kind of engineer who sat behind glass and drew diagrams that other people executed and then forgot about. He was the kind who got down into the engine bay, who understood torque and heat distribution and metal fatigue the way a musician understands rhythm, not intellectually, as a set of principles to be applied, but physically, in the hands, in the gut, in the particular sensitivity of fingers that have spent years working with machines until the machines become almost familiar. His colleagues respected him. His supervisors promoted him. His work spoke with the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise its voice. And then, in the winter of his 36th year, he discovered something that changed everything. The way discoveries like that always do, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once and irreversibly. A fuel efficiency test had been falsified, not once, dozens of times, across multiple vehicle lines, systematically adjusted to present numbers to regulators and consumers that the vehicles could not actually achieve under real-world conditions. He brought it to his manager. His manager told him to let it go, told him this was the kind of thing that had always happened and always would happen, and the correct response was to understand that and move forward. He brought it to the division head. The division head told him the same thing with less patience and more menace, in the explicit language of a man used to having problems disappear. Marcus wrote a formal report and submitted it to the compliance office with careful documentation that took him 2 weeks to compile. 3 weeks later, he was called into a meeting with 2 HR representatives and a lawyer he had never seen before, handed a termination agreement, and walked to his car by a man in a security vest who had the blank courtesy of someone paid to make unpleasant situations proceed without incident. He drove home in silence, in the particular silence of a man whose entire professional identity has just been reclassified as a liability. He sat in his apartment for a long time after that. His ex-wife had taken their daughter to Phoenix 2 years prior, the marriage having dissolved under the slow pressure of long hours and emotional distance, and the apartment in Detroit was exactly as quiet as all of that sounds. He had savings. He spent them carefully, over months, applying to positions at other firms, getting callbacks that led to second interviews, that led to conversations that went nowhere, watching the number in his bank account drop with the slow certainty of a tide going out that doesn't come back. The industry is smaller than it appears from the outside. Word had moved. By the time he saw the listing for the garage, 1 paragraph in a local property database, 2 photographs that made the place look worse than it was, which is difficult to accomplish, and a price that seemed like a typo, until he called and confirmed it was real, He had $2,040 left to his name and a slowly calcifying understanding that safe options were a luxury he could no longer afford. He spent 2,000 of them without sleeping on it. He was done waiting for the right moment. The right moment had stopped coming. The inside of the garage was worse than the outside, which is saying something about both of them. Mice had colonized the far corner with what appeared to be generational commitment, building a civilization of nesting material from shredded cardboard and insulation foam. Rain had come through the roof so many times that a section of the eastern wall had developed its own ecosystem, mold and moss, in shades of green and gray, growing in a long diagonal strip where the water ran consistently, season after season, patient and indifferent. The electricity had been cut off for over 2 years, which meant that the first weeks of work happened by flashlight and the pale, flat light of Detroit winter afternoons, the sun low and diffuse and unwilling to penetrate very far through the gaps in the boards. Marcus brought a broom and started there, at the beginning of things, at the most fundamental act of assertion a person can make in a space, clearing it, claiming it, insisting that what is here is not final. He hauled trash bags out to the curb for days. He tore down what could not be saved and reinforced what could, working in the cold with the systematic patience of someone who has decided not to be stopped by conditions. His hands bled in 3 different places on the first afternoon, and he wrapped them in paper towels and kept going. The neighbors watched from their porches and front windows, with the patient skepticism of people who had seen ambition arrive in that neighborhood before and leave again having accomplished mostly noise. A man named Gerald Pruitt, who lived in the house directly adjacent to the garage and who had watched the place decay through 2 previous owners, leaned over the chain-link fence on the 3rd day and studied Marcus with the evaluating gaze of someone trying to determine if the person in front of him was principled or simply confused. "Son," he said finally, with genuine curiosity rather than cruelty, "what exactly are you building over there?" Marcus told him, in the plain terms of someone who had stopped needing his plans to sound impressive. Gerald looked at the garage for a long moment, assessed something in Marcus's face, and said, "All right," and went back inside. It wasn't encouragement. Exactly, but it wasn't the version of dismissal Marcus had received from everyone else. And at that point in his life, he was calibrated carefully enough to know the difference. The car was on the 6th day. He had been working through the back half of the garage, dragging out the last accumulation of junk, when his flashlight hit the canvas tarp and stopped him. It was pushed into the deepest corner, a large, blunt shape beneath fabric that had fused to the floor in several places from years of moisture, seeping underneath and drying and seeping again. He peeled the tarp back slowly, the way you handle something old and potentially breakable, not rushing, even though every instinct in him wanted to see what was underneath. What was underneath was a 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1 in what had once been grabber orange, the particular shade of orange that Ford had offered that year that was not subtle in any respect, an orange that was a statement in itself. Now it was mostly gray, beneath a thick film of rust and road grime and years. The paint bubbled and peeling back from the metal in long strips, the interior torn and bloated from water infiltration, the engine seized from years of sitting without circulation, the tires flat and cracked at the sidewalls. Marcus stood there in the flashlight glow for a very long time without moving. A mechanic with less experience, or a less disciplined imagination, would have seen junk. Marcus saw a puzzle. He also saw something harder to name, the specific feeling of a problem that exactly fits the size and shape of your capabilities, the feeling that arrives not as excitement but as calm. He ran his hand along the quarter panel and felt the original steel beneath the rust, solid and thick the way they had made things back then, before the economics of production had chipped away at the material itself. He opened the hood and looked at the engine block in the flashlight beam and started doing arithmetic in his head, the kind that had nothing to do with money. He knew what the car was worth restored. He knew what it would take. He also knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who has nothing else to bet on, that this was what the next months were going to be about. It took him 2 weeks to source the parts he needed, moving through salvage yards and online sellers, and the particular ecosystem of vintage car enthusiasts who trade in parts the way other people trade in currency, each transaction requiring its own negotiation about condition and authenticity, and price. Some parts arrived in boxes that had been damaged in shipping and had to be argued about. Others arrived in better condition than advertised. Small mercies in a stretch of the work where small mercies mattered. Gerald Pruitt appeared one morning about 3 weeks in with a portable welding unit on a dolly and the quiet dignity of a man offering what he actually has without making a performance of it. It emerged, in the way that things emerge in a garage when men are working alongside each other, that Gerald had spent 22 years as a structural welder before his knees gave out, and his employer decided not to accommodate the deterioration. A familiar story in that neighborhood, a story with a recognizable shape. Marcus accepted the help without ceremony. They worked side by side in the cold, the welding torch throwing light across both their faces. And Gerald never asked for anything in return except to be kept informed of progress, and Marcus kept him informed with the same directness he applied to everything. The Mustang took 43 days, from the first moment of diagnosis to the final adjustment. 43 days of working through evenings, through weekends, through every hour Marcus could carve out of a life that had emptied itself of other demands. He rebuilt the engine from components that had never been designed to work together, which required a level of creative mechanical engineering he hadn't been asked to exercise since the best years at Dalton, the years before the compliance report, before the slow discovery that the institution he was serving didn't share his values. He fabricated a bracket from scrap steel he found in the back corner of the garage that solved a mounting problem no standard aftermarket part could address, bending and welding and grinding until the solution was right, not just serviceable. He mixed paint by hand, testing batches against the remaining traces of original paint on the underside of the hood, until he matched the grabber orange as closely as chemistry would allow. He replaced the interior, using leather salvaged from a wrecked luxury sedan that a salvage yard sold him by the yard, cutting it to the original seat contours by feel and measurement, using an upholstery technique he had taught himself from library books years ago and never had occasion to use. When he finally turned the key, and the engine caught not on the first try, which would have been too easy, but on the third, after he traced and corrected a fuel delivery issue that took 2 hours to identify, and the engine note filled the garage with the deep, healthy resonance of something restored to its intended purpose, Marcus sat behind the wheel without moving for several minutes. His hands were on top of the steering wheel. The engine idled at a steady rhythm. Gerald Pruitt stood in the doorway with his arms folded, looking at the car, and said nothing, because the situation had achieved the kind of completeness that commentary would only diminish. Marcus pulled out his phone and recorded 60 seconds of the car idling, no narration, no framing, just the engine sound, and the orange paint catching the work light, and the cracked concrete floor of the garage in the background. Everything unglamorous and honest about the setting left visible. He posted it without a caption. He went to sleep. By morning, 400,000 people had watched it. By the following evening, the number had crossed 2 million, and was still moving. The messages arrived in a volume he hadn't anticipated, which in retrospect he should have, because what the video showed, a restored car in a real garage with no production value and no obvious performance, was exactly the kind of thing that finds its audience in that environment, the audience that has developed a calibrated sensitivity to authenticity and recognizes it instantly when it appears. Among the enthusiasts and collectors and people who simply loved cars, there were also practical inquiries, specific requests, from people who had vehicles with problems and were suddenly very interested in who this man was and where his garage was located. Marcus answered every message himself, personally, in the early hours before and after the work that now occupied his days. He was direct about what he could do and honest about what he couldn't, which is a rarer combination in automotive service than it should be, and which people responded to with the particular relief of having expected disappointment and not received it. He quoted prices that were lower than any established shop in the area. Not as a strategy, but as an honest reflection of his overhead, and promised turnaround times that he could actually meet because he had no employees yet and no organizational inefficiency to protect. The first customer, a man named Thomas, who worked in insurance and drove a 2014 BMW that had been turned away from 3 different shops with 3 different explanations for a transmission hesitation that none of them had actually diagnosed, arrived on a Saturday morning and handed Marcus the keys with the resigned expression of someone who has learned to keep his expectations very low. Marcus found the problem in 40 minutes, a sensor degradation that was causing intermittent miscommunication between the transmission control module and the gear actuators, an issue that required knowing where to look rather than expensive equipment, and fixed it in 3 hours. Thomas stood in the garage doorway and watched the second half of the repair with an expression that shifted progressively from polite skepticism to genuine attention, to the kind of mild astonishment that a person tries to contain because showing it too plainly feels like an admission. He paid in full, tipped generously, and told 3 people before he reached his car. Those 3 people told others. Within 6 weeks, Marcus had more work than he could handle alone, and a clear sense of what came next. He hired Danny Reeves first, a mechanic from 2 streets over, who had been laid off from a factory supplier 18 months earlier when the contract went to a cheaper operation in another state, a man in his mid-40s who carried the careful dignity of someone determined not to let circumstances define his self-estimation. He hired Calvin's second, Calvin Marsh, 23, self-taught from salvage yard experience and repair forums, and the kind of concentrated attention that substitutes for formal training when a person is hungry enough to learn. Calvin was faster with his hands than anyone Marcus had ever worked alongside, with an instinctive sense for where a problem was located before diagnostic tools confirmed it. Marcus paid them both what the work was worth and explained his reasoning on every repair, so that their knowledge compounded rather than simply accumulated. The garage began to feel like a thing with purpose, which is different from a thing with activity. Evelyn Carter did not believe in sentiment and had made a career of demonstrating that belief consistently. She had inherited the position of CEO of Carter Automotive from her father, who had built the company into a regional institution, and she had expanded it aggressively through acquisition and competitive pricing and the systematic elimination of inefficiency, which sometimes included the elimination of people who represented inefficiency in ways they hadn't agreed to. She was 44 years old, precise in her speech and her appearance and her judgment, and she had arrived at her position through an accumulation of decisions that she had made with the ruthlessness of someone who understood that sentiment, in business, is simply the willingness to lose more slowly. She had no particular animosity toward Marcus Hale when she first became aware of him. She had seen the Mustang video in a meeting, noted it as content, and moved on. But Marcus kept working. He kept being honest with customers who had learned to expect evasion. He kept posting the quiet documentation of careful work, and people kept watching and sharing it because they recognized something real when they encountered it. And when a fleet manager named Robert Calloway, who had sent premium vehicles to Carter Automotive Service Center for 6 years with a contract worth substantial annual revenue, called to say he was redirecting 4 vehicles to a garage in East Detroit run by a man he had read about, Evelyn set down the quarterly report she was reviewing and picked up her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a parts distribution network that supplied several of the major regional distributors and had enough market reach to create supply problems for a small operation without appearing to be involved. The second was to a man whose relationship with Carter Automotive was not reflected in any organizational chart. Marcus noticed the supply disruptions within 2 weeks. Orders delayed, then denied on technical grounds that shifted each time he called to follow up. Alternative suppliers discovered identical problems when he approached them. He couldn't prove the connection, but he was a precise thinker, and the pattern was not ambiguous. He talked to Danny and Calvin without alarming them, and began sourcing from smaller regional suppliers at higher cost and longer lead times, which squeezed his margins and slowed his work and caused one client to go elsewhere and nearly caused a second to follow. He was working through the arithmetic of this one evening, how long the current situation could be sustained, what the break-even point looked like, what options existed when a man arrived in a suit with a document offering Marcus Hale $500,000 for the garage, the business, and all associated intellectual property, with a 48-hour window and an implicit understanding of what continued difficulty might look like. Marcus read the offer carefully. He handed it back. He said, "Tell whoever sent you that the answer is no." The man nodded and left without adjusting his expression. 2 days later, Evelyn Carter came herself. She arrived in a vehicle that communicated its expense without display, dressed with the precision that reflects not vanity but a particular kind of professional discipline, and she walked into the garage with the self-possession of someone accustomed to controlling the terms of every room she entered. Marcus was under a vehicle. He slid out, stood up, and looked at her with the equanimity of a man who had been expecting this conversation. She introduced herself without offering her hand. She made her case with intelligence and with the particular condescension of someone who believes they are explaining reality to a person who has not yet fully understood it, framing it as advice, as concern, as the perspective of someone with a better view of the landscape. She told him that $500,000 was a generous valuation for what the garage actually was. She told him that the forces operating in the regional automotive market were not visible from the inside of a small independent operation, and that operating without understanding them was a form of recklessness. She made it sound like she was doing him a favor. Marcus listened to everything without interrupting. Then he said, "I didn't build this place to sell it. Not to you, not to anyone." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between contempt and the very first increment of something different. She said, "You should think carefully about what you're doing." He said, "I have been." She left. That night, the garage was vandalized. Every vehicle on the premises was damaged, windows smashed, paint keyed, one engine bay left deliberately open to a rain that arrived at 2 in the morning with specific timing. The morning after was the worst he'd had since the morning at Dalton. He stood in the garage and looked at the wreckage with the kind of stillness that is not calm, but its opposite, a stillness that comes from being so far inside, a feeling that movement seems beside the point. Danny arrived early and read the situation and said nothing, which was the right thing. Calvin arrived 20 minutes after and did the same. The clients were not silent. 2 of them engaged attorneys. The insurance company sent an assessor who was thorough and patient and ultimately produced a finding that the company's policy did not cover the specific category of damage in the specific circumstances, a conclusion that required careful reading to understand and a certain experience of the world to recognize as what it was. The second week after the vandalism, Danny came to Marcus with the measured expression of a man delivering a truth he wishes he didn't have to deliver, and said that he had responsibilities beyond the garage, and he wasn't sure he could keep going if the situation didn't change. Marcus told him he understood, and that Danny should do what he had to do. He meant it without bitterness. Calvin stayed without explanation. He simply continued arriving, which said everything. Gerald Pruitt began appearing at the garage in the late mornings with his camping stove and the particular shade of terrible coffee that only camping stoves produce, and he sat in the corner with his arms folded and kept Marcus company without requiring conversation, which was a form of loyalty so quiet that it almost passes unnoticed, which is precisely why it matters. It was on a Thursday evening, 11 o'clock. The garage lit by one work light, and the city outside the open bay going about its indifferent business, when Gerald came in and set a cardboard box on the workbench. It was sealed with tape that had yellowed and dried to the texture of dead leaves. He said nothing about it. Marcus opened it. Inside, organized with the careful attention of a man who took ideas seriously, were technical drawings, dense, detailed, annotated in Marcus's own hand from years ago, the handwriting of a younger version of himself who still believed that the right idea presented to the right people through the right channels would be received on its merits. The drawings described a hybrid engine architecture, a system that solved with genuine elegance, not with compromise, the long-standing problem of achieving significant fuel efficiency improvements without proportional losses in performance output, the problem that had defined the industry's ambitions and frustrated its engineers for a generation. Marcus had developed these designs during the last 2 years at Dalton, had taken them through the internal review process, had sat in rooms and explained them to people who nodded and asked about budget timelines, and then let the idea dissolve into the institution. He had forgotten, in the years since, that he had left a copy with Gerald, for reasons he couldn't now entirely reconstruct. He spread the drawings across the workbench and looked at them for a long time, tracing the lines with his finger, running the engineering in his head, updated now by everything he'd learned in the intervening years. He did not sleep that night. Calvin found him at 6 in the morning at the workbench, surrounded by calculations on legal pad paper, the night's coffee long cold, the work light still on against a dawn that had arrived without his noticing. Marcus looked up and said, with the directness of a man who has finished deciding, "I want to build a car." Calvin sat on an overturned crate, looked at the drawings spread across the bench, and said, "Okay, that was sufficient." Marcus sold the last assets of real value that he possessed: his laptop, his better tools, the watch his father had worn for 20 years, and left him without ceremony or instruction. He called Danny, who came back. He reached 2 former Dalton engineers who had left the company under circumstances that rhymed with his own, and were now working positions that kept them busy without using them. And both of them answered on the first call. Nobody asked about compensation. The arrangement was understood in the way that genuine bets are understood: either the hand works, or it doesn't, but you commit to playing it. They worked in rotations around the continuing client repairs, and around the supply problems that had still not fully resolved, and around the cold, which persisted in that Detroit spring with the particular stubbornness of cold that has been in a building long enough to feel like resident. Marcus documented the build on a live stream not as a performance, but as a record, as evidence, because he had learned that the most dangerous thing that can happen to work done in a small space is to be invisible, to be dismissed without witness. The audience that had formed around the Mustang video came back and stayed, and brought others, and the accumulation of that attention had its own weight, its own kind of protection. By the time the build was 3 weeks in, Evelyn Carter responded with what she had. A piece appeared in a trade publication that covered the regional automotive market, questioning Marcus's professional credentials, raising questions about the safety standards of a vehicle being assembled outside of a regulated manufacturing facility, using words like amateur and unverified with the careful indirection of something designed to wound without being actionable. The piece circulated for 48 hours and was largely dismissed in the community of people who had been watching the build and understood what they were looking at, but it circulated at a level that reached the edges of his client base and caused 2 inquiries that Marcus had to address directly. He did not respond to the piece. The evening it was published, he posted a close-up video of the engine block with no narration and let the engineering make its own argument. A man named Richard Strand, who had spent 30 years identifying and funding automotive innovation before other people recognized it as such, watched the live stream from his home in Ann Arbor on a Tuesday evening with the focused attention of someone who does not watch things casually, and made a call to his assistant afterward. And a message arrived in Marcus's email the following morning that was 4 sentences long and asked if he was available to talk. The expo was the largest automotive industry event in the region. Held annually at the Convention Center on Jefferson Avenue, a gathering that mattered in the specific way that things matter when the right people are in the same room at the same time, and a decision made there carries weight for months afterward. It was the kind of event that industry people referred to as a barometer, not for what was being shown, exactly, but for what the showing revealed about direction, about confidence, about which companies believed in what they were doing enough to put it in front of an audience that knew the difference between substance and performance. Carter Automotive had a flagship presence, a large main-floor display, vehicles positioned under engineered light, staff trained to the specific register of informed enthusiasm, Evelyn herself working the room with the precision of someone who has done this enough times to execute without effort, and still appear to be fully present. Marcus applied for exhibitor space with a company registration that was weeks old, and an address that any attendee could have identified as a modest structure in a neighborhood that was not associated with automotive prestige, and the organizers gave him space in the annex, the secondary hall, separated from the main floor by a corridor and a pair of doors that announced themselves with a squeak every time they swung open, the room historically reserved for entrants, whose legitimacy had not yet been established to the satisfaction of the people who decided legitimacy. Marcus took the space without complaint, without irony, without any visible acknowledgement that there was a story in the placement. He arrived the morning of the expo with his team and a rented trailer, and they set up in the efficient silence of people who have been through enough together to have stopped needing to narrate the process. The car sat under a plain cloth cover in the center of the space. There was no branded backdrop, no lighting rig, no music selected to create an ambient mood. There was a car under a cloth, and there was Marcus standing next to it. And there was the particular quality of stillness that comes from a person who is completely prepared and has nothing left to perform. The main hall drew the crowd first, as it always did. People moved through Carter Automotive's display, with the comfortable confidence of visiting something established. Evelyn stood near the flagship model in a white blazer, reading the room, receiving information from staff, processing all of it with the composed efficiency of someone who has trained herself to contain her reactions regardless of what they are. She had been informed that Hale was in the annex. She allowed herself one private moment of contempt and moved on. In the annex, the crowd built slowly, and then not slowly. Enthusiasts came first, then journalists who had been pointed in that direction by the enthusiasts, then industry people who had seen the crowd thickening and followed it with the instinct of people who have learned to pay attention to what other people are paying attention to. By the time Marcus pulled the cloth from the car, the space was full, and the murmur that ran through the crowd when the car appeared was the involuntary sound of expectation being revised. The car was not ornate. It was not trying to be beautiful in the way of things designed to appeal to the broadest possible audience. It was designed from the engine outward, from the technology forward, with an aesthetic that emerged from the engineering rather than being applied to it, and it had the specific beauty of things that are exactly what they need to be, and nothing more. When Marcus started the engine, the room achieved the particular silence that only gathers before a result. The engine turned over with a sound that was lower and more controlled than its displacement suggested. And the performance display beside the car output numbers, efficiency figures, the specific measurements that engineers use to evaluate claims registered readings that made two automotive engineers near the front step forward simultaneously, involuntarily, as if proximity might help them reconcile what they were reading with what they understood to be possible. Richard Strand stood in the back of the annex with his hands in his pockets and watched the room with the expression of someone who has seen enough things develop to recognize when one is developing correctly. He had already decided what he was going to do. He was watching the rest of the room arrive at the edge of the same understanding. A journalist who had covered the automotive industry for 17 years asked a technical question in the careful language of someone who knows enough to know what they're asking, and Marcus answered it with the precision and accessibility of someone who has explained the same idea 100 times in the same garage to people who needed to understand it, and the journalist stopped writing midway through the answer to simply listen. On the main floor, Evelyn Carter received a text from her communications director. She read it. She placed her phone face down on the display surface and stood very still for a moment that the person she was speaking with noticed and then pretended not to notice, and she smiled with the full control she had spent decades cultivating and said, "Excuse me." She came to the annex. She stood at the back of the crowd and she watched. Marcus saw her. He did not adjust anything in what he was doing. He continued answering questions. At some point, their eyes met across the packed room, and what passed between them was not triumphalism on one side and defeat on the other, but something more complicated, the mutual recognition that the situation had changed in ways that neither of them could reverse. When Richard Strand stepped forward from the back of the crowd and shook Marcus's hand in full view of the room, the brief conversation between them was observed by enough people to circulate through the industry networks present in that building before the expo had closed for the afternoon. The journalist's longer piece ran that evening online. She had been working on it for months, developing sources, verifying documents, building a record that could sustain the claim she intended to make. The documents showed that Dalton Automotive, acquired by Carter 3 years after Marcus's termination, had incorporated core elements of his engine design into a commercial vehicle line during the development cycle that followed the acquisition, without licensing, without credit, and without compensation. The piece was careful, specific, and had enough documentary support that Carter Automotive's legal response, a denial narrow enough in its specificity to confirm the underlying facts, actually deepened the damage rather than containing it. The story moved through trade publications and into broader business coverage within 18 hours. Picked up by outlets that had not previously paid attention to Carter Automotive, except as a stable regional institution, now paying very close attention to it as something else. Carter Automotive's institutional shareholders were not patient in normal circumstances, and they were especially impatient with scandals that arrived with documentation. The stock fell in 3 consecutive sessions. 2 major fleet clients issued statements. The board convened and then convened again, and at the second session Evelyn Carter was present for the opening and not for the rest. She sat in the anteroom of the building that bore her family name, in the white blazer she'd worn to the expo. And she thought about the sequence of decisions she had made. Not defensively, she was past the point where defense was useful, but with the analytical clarity that had served her well when she applied it to other people's situations and had apparently been harder to apply to her own. She was not destroyed. She would not be, and some part of her, the part that had survived everything that had built her, knew this already and held it quietly, but she was being reduced to her actual scale, stripped of the institutional armor that had allowed her for years to mistake the institution's power for her own. And this is its own kind of reckoning, the kind that is private and precise and cannot be appealed or negotiated around. Marcus heard about the board meeting while he was in the garage finishing a diagnostic. He read several messages, set his phone face down, the same gesture, the same instinct toward stillness at a critical moment, without knowing that she had made the same gesture, and went back to the car. There was still work to do. There is always still work to do. The acquisition offer arrived through Strand's legal team 6 weeks later, delivered with the calm efficiency of a transaction that has already been decided and requires only the formality of signatures to become real. Carter Automotive's valuation had declined sufficiently. Its leadership structure had destabilized enough, and the migration of clients toward Hale's expanding operation had continued long enough to make the arithmetic of the deal straightforward for everyone who looked at it honestly. Marcus sat at the workbench with the offer documents spread before him. Under the same work light that had illuminated the worst nights, Gerald's coffee going cold in the corner. He read everything carefully. He asked 2 questions. He signed where indicated. He called Danny first, then Calvin. Then he called his daughter in Phoenix, 12 years old, living the secondary version of this story, the one that children live in pieces because adults manage the information carefully. He told her things had worked out and that he was going to come visit soon and bring her something. She said, "Is it a car?" He said, "Part of one." She said that was fine, in the tone that 12-year-olds use when they have decided to take what they can get and move on to the next thing, which is a reasonable approach to most situations. The acquisition closed on a Thursday in March. Marcus arrived at the Carter Automotive headquarters before anyone else, early in the habit of early mornings that the garage had built in him, and he stood in the lobby and looked at the building with the same evaluating steadiness he had applied to the garage 14 months earlier. He made his structural decisions quickly and with the specificity of someone who had thought them through over many months of late nights and difficult mornings, and needed only the authority and the legal standing to implement them at scale. The leadership team would be rebuilt from the practice outward, not the prestige inward. The service model would be reorganized around transparency and craft. The company's compensation structure for mechanics and technicians would be adjusted to reflect the actual value of skilled technical labor, which had been systematically undervalued for long enough that the correction felt radical when it was actually just accurate. The company was renamed. The sign that went up over the headquarters read, "Hale Motors," in clean letters that didn't require elaboration. The sign that was placed on the East Detroit garage, the original one, the $2,000 one, read Hale Motors where it started. In the same clean letters. In the same proportions, communicating without commentary that both places were equally part of what the company was. Gerald Pruitt stood on the sidewalk in front of the garage on the morning the sign went up and looked at it for a long time with his arms folded, with the expression of a man who has watched something develop from nothing and is taking the measure of the distance between then and now. Marcus stood next to him in the cold. A truck went by. A dog across the street decided something interesting had happened and barked twice at nothing in particular. Gerald said, without looking away from the sign, "You still owe me for the welding gas." Marcus laughed the full version, the one that comes from a genuine place deep enough that it cannot be manufactured under pressure no matter how much you need it at the time, The kind of laughter that is also a form of proof, evidence of a person's actual condition that no performance can replicate. He said he'd settle the debt properly. Gerald said there was no rush. They stood there for another minute in the morning light, two men on a sidewalk in East Detroit, looking at a small sign on a building that the city had counted as worthless, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else was needed. Evelyn Carter relocated to a smaller city and took a consulting position in a field adjacent to but distinct from automotive manufacturing, which is the kind of professional move that allows a person to continue their career while also quietly beginning the process of reassessment that certain experiences require. She read about Hale Motors in the trade press without the bitterness she would have predicted for herself, which surprised her. She read one profile of Marcus, a long interview in a regional business publication, the kind of piece that a journalist writes when they have access to a subject who answers questions directly, in which he was asked what he had learned from the hardest period. He said, without particular drama, that he had learned the difference between the things that could be taken from him and the things that could not. His skill could not be taken. His judgment could not be taken. His willingness to begin again from the beginning could not be taken. Everything else, he said, was furniture. Evelyn read that twice, set the magazine on the side table, and did not pick it up again. She understood what he meant in a way she suspected she wouldn't have understood a year before. The garage sat in the early spring light of a Detroit morning, the orange Mustang visible through the open bay door, the paint bright and clean in the way of things that have been properly cared for, a finished thing in a space that had always been about the process of making things finished. Marcus arrived before anyone else, the way he always did. The habit of early mornings built into him by a year of work that had required him to be the first one there and the last one to leave. He walked through slowly, not inspecting it but inhabiting it, the specific movement of a person in a space that has become part of their story in ways they didn't plan and cannot now imagine being without. The smell of the place was the same as it had always been, motor oil and metal and something ambient and cold, and it was completely familiar in the way that the smell of a place you have worked in long enough becomes part of the texture of who you are. He ran his hand along the Mustang's quarter panel, the same gesture from the first night, in the dark with the flashlight, when the car was rust and uncertainty, and the particular kind of hope that doesn't yet know what it's hoping toward. He thought about his daughter coming to visit next month, about the things he wanted her to understand from all of this, that he was not yet sure how to put into words she would carry with her, not the story, because she would hear the story and would already have heard parts of it, but the thing underneath the story, the understanding that a person's actual worth is not determined by the institutions that evaluate them, or the markets that assign them a price, or the people in suits who arrive with offers designed to make you feel lucky to be considered. He thought about Gerald arriving in an hour with his camping stove, and his terrible coffee, and the absolute constancy of his presence, which had been a form of faith that Marcus had tried to honor by not failing. He thought about Calvin, who was now running the garage's training program, teaching young mechanics from the neighborhood the foundational knowledge that lives in the hands and cannot be taken away by anyone sitting in a boardroom who has never held a wrench or worked out what is wrong with a machine by listening to the way it breathes. He stood in the light of the open bay door and understood, not with satisfaction, which was too small a feeling for what he meant, but with something deeper and stiller than satisfaction, with the recognition of a man who has been tested completely and has found out something permanent about himself, that the garage had never really been about cars. It had been about what a person chooses to do when there is nothing left to choose from but themselves. The decision, made in the cold of a late November morning with $2,000 and no backup plan, to not let other people's assessment of a building or of him be the final word. The decision, made on a night when the garage was dark and the work was ruined, and the logical path was to accept the loss and go do something else. To keep going anyway. The decision, made each morning between then and now, to show up and do careful work with his hands and refuse to be invisible. Outside, the city was moving through its early business, the traffic building on the main roads, the light going from gray to pale gold across the rooftops of East Detroit. Somewhere in the building downtown that now carried his name, people were arriving to do careful work with their hands, paid fairly for the skill they brought, trained to develop that skill further, given the room to be genuinely good at what they were genuinely good at, which is all that any craftsman has ever asked for from the institutions they serve. In the original garage on the East Side Street, where nobody had believed anything worth believing could begin, where the mice had built their civilization in the corner, and the rain had come through the roof for seasons without interruption, and a man in a suit had once arrived with $500,000 and a barely concealed threat, Marcus Hale picked up a wrench and got back to it, because that was the thing that had always been the thing, and no amount of change in the circumstances around it altered what the work was, or what it required. You show up. You pay attention. You do not stop. Everything else, in the end, follows.